The aluminum skin of the carrier buckles inward. Rivets scream. In the half-second before impact, sailors on the deck of the USS St. see the pilot's face through the shattered canopy. A boy, maybe 19, mouth open in what might be a scream or a prayer. Then the Zero disintegrates against the flight deck with the sound of 1,000 church bells struck simultaneously. The explosion doesn't come from the plane alone. The 500-pound bomb strapped beneath its fuselage detonates on contact, punching through steel plate like tissue paper. Fuel ignites. Aviation ordnance stored below deck cooks off in sympathetic detonations. Within 90 seconds, a second kamikaze slams into the exact same wound, driving deeper into the carrier's guts. The St. Lo has 30 minutes to live. It is October 25th, 1944. Lieutenant Yukio Seki has just made history, though he will never know it. The escort carrier settling into the Philippine Sea behind him is the first ship in modern naval warfare to be sunk by a suicide attack. What began as a desperate experiment, young men transformed into guided missiles, has become Japan's final doctrine. Over the next 9 months, thousands more will follow Seki into that terminal dive. But 4 days earlier, the special attack units had been a humiliation. Lieutenant Yoshiyasu Kuno sat in the cockpit of his Zero at Mabalacat Airfield, engine idling, and made a promise to his superiors. If he found no American carriers at sea, he would redirect to Leyte Gulf, where targets clustered like fish in a barrel. His wingmen returned that evening. Kuno did not. Between October 21st and 24th, sortie after sortie lifted off from Mabalacat's rutted runway. Every single pilot came back, fuel tanks drained, bombs still attached to their wings. The Philippine Sea stretched empty beneath them. American carriers, those floating fortresses that had broken Japan's back at Midway, had vanished into the maritime haze. The misconception persists that kamikaze pilots flew only one-way missions, that survival was never an option. The truth corrodes that myth. Pilots returned regularly when they failed to locate worthy targets. The image of the inevitable death ride is a post-war invention. These men carried parachutes, though few wore them. They received orders to abort if conditions proved unfavorable. The machinery of suicide warfare required pragmatism. A wasted pilot and aircraft served no strategic purpose. Better to return, refuel, and hunt again tomorrow. But by mid-1944, tomorrow was running out. The mathematics of the Pacific War had turned catastrophic for Japan. American shipyards launched escort carriers in the time it took Japanese yards to repair a cruiser. Fuel reserves dwindled to the point where training flights became luxuries Japan could not afford. Pilot quality plummeted as veterans died, and their replacements received perhaps 40 hours of flight time before being shoved into combat. Conventional aerial warfare had become a calculus of futility. For every American plane shot down, Japan lost 4. The empire was bleeding out at altitude. Enter the special attack units. Not through fanaticism alone, though nationalism coursed through their veins like transfused blood. The reality was textured with complexity that propaganda could never capture. Many pilots volunteered, yes, but volunteering in Imperial Japan carried pressures unknown to Western militaries. Peer pressure in a culture that venerated self-sacrifice. Family honor that could be stained by perceived cowardice. The very real belief that an American invasion would bring horrors to their mothers and sisters. These boys, and they were boys, some still 17, faces that had never needed a razor, climbed into cockpits carrying a cocktail of duty, fear, nationalism, and resignation that no single word could encompass. their training had become a cruel joke, where American naval aviators spent 2 years learning their craft. Kamikaze pilots received weeks. They learned to take off, to navigate by landmark and compass, and to aim their aircraft at a ship's silhouette. Landing was not part of the curriculum. Why waste fuel and flight time teaching a skill they would never use? Their aircraft reflected this terminal economy. Mitsubishi Zeros, once the apex predator of Pacific skies, were stripped of radios, sometimes even weapons, to save weight for explosives. Older models like the Ki-51 Sonia, obsolete as bombers, found new purpose as manned missiles. The Sonia was a graceless thing, a fixed-gear light bomber that lumbered through the air at speeds an American Hellcat could exceed while climbing. Its radial engine coughed black smoke. Its single rear-facing machine gun provided only psychological comfort to the gunner, who would die alongside the pilot. But loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb and flown by a man who didn't need to return, it became something else entirely. A vector, a mathematical problem for American gun crews working behind the Mk-37 fire control system, trying to track an aircraft that jinks and weaves and seems to accelerate as it nears, propelled not by engine thrust, but by the gravity of its terminal dive. The first official victory changed everything. After Seki's attack on the St. Lo, Japanese command saw possibility in the impossible. Here was a weapon that could bypass American fighter screens, that could evade anti-aircraft fire through sheer unpredictability, that transformed Japan's greatest liability, pilot inexperience, into irrelevance. Accuracy mattered less when the bomb and pilot arrived together, when the guidance system had a human brain and eyes that could compensate for wind, for evasive maneuvers, for the target's desperate last-second turns. The tactics evolved with brutal efficiency. Kamikaze formations would approach as a group, a cluster of contacts on radar screens that made interception straightforward. Then, at the edge of effective range, they scattered like startled birds. Combat information centers suddenly tracked 8 targets instead of 1, and each required its own fighter response. The pilots learned to vary altitude wildly, skimming wavetops one moment, climbing to 3,000 feet the next, fracturing the defensive fire that relied on predicted flight paths. They learned to approach from the direction of the sun, that ancient dogfighting wisdom. They learned to target the ships that looked most important, the carriers whose flight decks sprawled like city blocks, the battleships whose superstructures bristled with guns. American naval doctrine had to metastasize to survive this threat. The concept of radar picket destroyers, already in use, became a defensive wall. These ships positioned themselves between the fleet and likely attack vectors, sometimes 95 miles out from the carriers they protected. They served as early warning systems and sacrificial offerings both. When kamikazes appeared on their radar, the picket destroyers had minutes to scramble combat air patrols and illuminate targets for the Hellcats orbiting overhead. Often, those kamikazes ignored the carriers entirely and dove on the pickets themselves. These destroyers, thin-skinned and crammed with fuel and ammunition, died spectacularly. Off Okinawa, 16 radar picket stations formed a constellation of watchfulness around the invasion fleet. Each station typically held 2 destroyers and a handful of support gunboats. They existed in a state of perpetual tension, scanning skies that could birth death at any moment. The men aboard these ships understood their role with bitter clarity. They were bait. They were the tripwire. When the alarm sounded and bogies appeared on the scope, they knew those bogies might be coming specifically for them. The proximity fuse revolutionized anti-aircraft warfare just in time to matter. Previous doctrine required a direct hit or a precisely timed airburst to down an aircraft. The proximity fuse used miniaturized radar to detonate a shell when it passed within lethal range of an enemy plane. Suddenly, every 5-inch shell became a spreading cloud of shrapnel. Gun crews no longer aimed at where the plane was, but at where it would be, filling volumes of sky with steel. The technology saved thousands of lives, but it could not save them all. When defense failed, when the combat air patrol was overwhelmed, and the proximity-fused shells missed, and the kamikazes broke through, ships fell back on the oldest naval tactic, the defensive circle. High-value vessels, carriers, ammunition ships, tankers, occupied the center. Destroyers and cruisers formed concentric rings around them, presenting overlapping fields of fire. The air became a storm of tracers, the sky so thick with metal that birds fell dead from the pressure waves. James Fahey witnessed such a moment, his ship circling a tanker, while kamikazes probed for gaps in the formation. He wrote later of the surreal beauty of it. The tanker, alone in the center, like some religious icon, the destroyers wheeling around it with every gun hammering, the sky streaked with tracer fire and exploding shells. Better than the movies, he wrote. But unlike the movies, men were dying in those cockpits, and men were dying on those decks when the planes broke through. They broke through with numbing regularity. On October 30th, 1944, off Luzon, a kamikaze struck the USS Franklin, carving through her flight deck and igniting aviation fuel. Fires raged for 3 hours. She limped away for repairs but returned to the carrier force in time for Okinawa, her crew still smelling of smoke and burn cream. The USS Belleau Wood took a hit near her fantail the same day. Before the flames were extinguished, her planes were launching again, because carriers that could not launch planes were carriers that died. She returned to action in time to strike Tokyo in February 1945, her hull patched, her crew hollow-eyed. In November, 4 months into the Kamikaze campaign, 2 suicide planes hit the USS Intrepid within minutes of each other. Both punched through her flight deck. Both ignited fires that threatened the ammunition stores below. She survived barely and retired for repairs. But by Okinawa, the Intrepid was back, her deck crews working under a sky that might open up and vomit fire at any moment. The USS Essex absorbed a bomb-carrying kamikaze on November 25th during strikes against central Luzon. The plane crashed into the port side of the flight deck, detonating on impact. The fires and damage failed to halt operations. She continued launching and recovering aircraft as though nothing had happened, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant the kamikazes had won. The USS Saratoga, one of the grand old ladies of the pre-war carrier fleet, endured 2 bombs and 4 kamikazes in the span of 2 hours in February 1945. She survived through some combination of excellent damage control, luck, and the sheer stubbornness of a crew that refused to let their ship die. She made it back to port, her hull a constellation of impact craters and burn scars. The USS Randolph sat at anchor when a kamikaze found her during a night attack. Most of the crew was in the carrier cinema watching a movie, seeking 2 hours of escape from the war. The plane struck the flight deck and exploded. Men died in their seats, still holding popcorn. April 1945 saw the Intrepid hit again, her 3rd kamikaze strike, this time starting fires that temporarily knocked her out of action. But temporary was the operative word. By the war's end, the Intrepid was back. July 29, 1945, brought the final confirmed kamikaze strikes of the war. The USS Young and USS Haworth both suffered damage from these last-ditch efforts. By then, Japan was burning. Firebombing had reduced cities to ash fields. The blockade had choked off food imports. Starvation gnawed at the civilian population. And still, the kamikaze pilots climbed into their cockpits because orders were orders and shame was worse than death. 3 days earlier, British ships participating in Operation Livery, naval airstrikes against Japanese-occupied Malaya, faced the kamikaze threat in waters far from Okinawa's killing grounds. HMS Ameer took a direct hit that killed 20 men and caused such catastrophic damage that the crew had to abandon ship. She was scuttled rather than risk her magazine detonating during salvage attempts. She became the only British warship sunk by a kamikaze attack and the last Royal Navy loss of the entire conflict. But in that same operation, another British ship encountered what can only be called a miracle wrapped in steel. HMS Sussex, a heavy cruiser, found herself targeted by a kamikaze during the same attack that doomed the Ameer. The plane dove toward her waterline. Impact was inevitable. The crew braced for the explosion that would rip, open her hull, and send her to the bottom. The explosion never came. The plane struck near the waterline with enough force to leave a perfect silhouette imprinted on the Sussex's hull, but the bomb failed to detonate. Or perhaps it had already detached. Or perhaps the aircraft had been so damaged by defensive fire that it hit at insufficient speed to trigger the fuse. Post-war analysis of the imprint revealed details so precise they bordered on the unbelievable. The outline matched exactly the profile of a Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonia, down to the undercarriage and wing shapes. The scorch marks told a story. The Sonia had approached low, starboard wing tip, dragging in the water. Fuselage canted at an angle that suggested catastrophic damage or loss of control. Heavy scoring corresponding to the fuselage indicated the bomb bay area took the brunt of the impact. An official report stated that defensive weapons had targeted the aircraft, which was shot down in flames. Witnesses reported seeing the pilot raise his hands before impact, whether in surrender, despair, or an attempt to shield his face from the anti-aircraft fire that was tearing his plane apart. No one could say. Perhaps the defensive fire clipped the Sonia on its final approach, tearing off the starboard wing and causing the bomb to detach prematurely. Perhaps the plane hit the water first, shedding momentum and ordnance before caroming into the Sussex's hull with all the force of a particularly aggressive fender bender. Whatever the mechanism, the Sussex sailed away with nothing more than a striking conversation piece scarred into her hull and a crew that spent the rest of their lives aware of exactly how lucky they had been. The kamikaze campaign inflicted wounds that statistics struggle to convey. From October 19, 1944, to the war's end in August 1945, approximately 4,000 kamikaze pilots died in these missions. They launched thousands of attacks. They sank or damaged hundreds of Allied ships. They caused more than 7,000 Allied casualties. Men burned alive in fuel fires. Men crushed under collapsing steel. Men drowned in compartments that flooded too fast for the watertight doors to save them. After the war, Vice Admiral Charles Brown reflected on the psychological impact of facing an enemy who weaponized his own death. There was a hypnotic fascination to the sight, he wrote, so alien to our Western philosophy. We watched each plunging kamikaze with the detached horror of one witnessing a terrible spectacle rather than as the intended victim. We forgot ourselves for the moment as we groped hopelessly for the thought of that man up there. That man up there, not a monster, not a fanatic devoid of humanity. a man, a boy, often. Someone's son making a choice that was not entirely a choice, flying toward a death that served a cause he may or may not have believed in with his whole heart. The letters they left behind complicate the narrative that post-war propaganda tried to simplify. Ichizo Hayashi wrote to his mother several days before his final flight in April 1945. His words carry the weight of honesty that men confronting death often achieve. I cannot say that the wish to die for the Emperor is genuine coming from my heart. However, it is decided for me that I die for the Emperor. That single sentence contains more truth about the kamikaze phenomenon than 1,000 propaganda posters. The special attack units were not composed entirely of brainwashed zealots eager to immolate themselves for a divine emperor. They were young men caught in the machinery of a dying empire, pushed by culture and circumstance, and the unbearable weight of expectations into cockpits they could not leave. Some volunteered out of genuine belief. Some volunteered because not volunteering meant bringing shame on their families. Some did not volunteer at all, but accepted the inevitable with the resignation of men who understood that history had already written their final chapter. The kamikaze campaign failed in its strategic objective. It did not drive the American fleet from Japanese waters. It did not prevent the invasion of Okinawa, or the firebombing of Tokyo, or the atomic obliteration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What it did achieve was the prolonging of a war already lost, the squandering of Japan's remaining youth, and the creation of a tactic so horrifying that it would haunt naval warfare doctrine for generations. Even today, when naval planners war game scenarios in the Pacific, the shadow of the kamikaze looms, the asymmetric threat, the enemy who cannot be deterred by the prospect of death because death is the mission. The imprint on HMS Sussex's hull remained visible for years after the war, a ghost made of scorched steel and memory. Sailors who served aboard her would point it out to new crew members, telling the story of the plane that hit but didn't kill. Some called it luck, some called it divine intervention, some simply called it the chaos of war, where the difference between catastrophe and survival can hinge on a wing shearing off at the right moment, or a bomb tumbling free instead of detonating. But in the larger calculus of the Pacific War, the Sussex's survival was an anomaly. More common were the ships that didn't survive, the crews that didn't come home, the sailors who burned or drowned or were blown apart by aircraft, turned into weapons. The kamikaze campaign was one of history's most desperate gambles, played with human lives as currency. It bought Japan nothing but time, and time only prolonged the suffering. The final kamikaze attacks came in late July 1945, just days before the atomic bombs fell. By then, Japan was a nation on the brink of collapse. Food was scarce. Industry had ground to a near halt. The military was preparing for Operation Katsugo, the defense of the home islands, a plan that called for the entire civilian population to fight to the death rather than surrender. The kamikaze was not an aberration in this context. It was the logical conclusion of a culture that had backed itself into a corner where death seemed preferable to the dishonor of defeat. But surrender came anyway, after Hiroshima, after Nagasaki, after the Soviet Union declared war and crushed the Kwantung Army in Manchuria in a matter of days. The Emperor's radio address on August 15th told the Japanese people that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. That understatement, delivered in formal court language most citizens barely understood, ended the kamikaze campaign along with everything else. The men who had trained as kamikazes but never flew their final mission faced a strange new world. They had prepared for death, had written their farewell letters, had made peace with non-existence. And then they had to learn how to live again. Some adapted, some did not. The psychological scars of being selected for suicide missions, of surviving when you expected to die, of questioning whether you were relieved or ashamed to still draw breath. Those wounds never fully healed. The ships that survived the Kamikaze campaign carried their own scars. Flight decks patched with steel that didn't quite match the original plating. Bulkheads reinforced where fires had weakened the structure. Crews who flinched at the sound of aircraft engines, who scanned the sky compulsively even in friendly waters, who woke from nightmares of planes diving out of the sun, trailing smoke and death. The Kamikaze left an indelible mark on the Pacific War, not just in the tonnage sunk or the lives lost, but in the psychological dimension. It introduced an element of horror into naval warfare that conventional combat, as terrible as it was, had lacked. A torpedo could be evaded, a bomb could miss, but a kamikaze could adjust, could compensate, could chase you with human intelligence guiding it all the way to impact. The threat was personal in a way that mechanized warfare usually was not. Somewhere in that diving aircraft was a man who had chosen to kill you, even if it meant killing himself. The intimacy of that violence, the directness of it, left marks that outlasted the war. And so, HMS Sussex sailed on, bearing her strange scar, a testament to the unpredictable nature of combat and the razor-thin margins between tragedy and survival. The imprint of the Sonia on her hull became a teaching tool, a reminder that in war, fortune matters as much as skill. The crew who survived that day owed their lives to factors beyond their control, the chaos of kinetic energy and structural failure playing out in fractions of a second. But most ships were not so lucky. Most crews did not get to tell their story. The special attack units exacted a terrible price, paid in blood and burning oil, and the screams of men trapped in flooding compartments. The Kamikaze campaign stands as one of the war's darkest chapters, a monument to desperation and the terrible things human beings will do when they believe they have no other choice.